This video is going to be part 2 of the animation controller video. And the first question we're going to answer is, if a player enters the game while an animation is already playing, will the animation start in sync with other players? So let's create a basic animation. So the first thing I'm going to do is inside of Workspace, create a model. Inside of this model, I'm going to create a part. I'm going to set the part size to 222 and the position to 0, 10, -20. And I'm going to turn all these off and set anchored to true. I'm also going to rename this part to be called part 0. And I'm going to set the transparency to be 0.8. I'm now going to duplicate this part and change the name to part 1. And I'm going to set transparency to 0. And I'm going to turn anchored off. And I'm going to move this part forward. Now inside of this part, I'm going to place a trowel. So I'm going to first add 2 attachments and a trowel. And I'm going to set attachment 0 to one of these attachments and attachment 1 to the other attachment. And let's now move these attachments. So because the part has a size of 2, I'm going to move the attachment by half the size, which is 1. So for one of the attachments, it's going to go up by 1 stud. And the other attachment is going to go down by 1 stud. And now I'm going to go back into the trowel and I'm going to set face camera to true. I'm going to set light emission to 1 and I'm going to change the transparency to fade out like so. Okay, so now I'm going to duplicate part 1 and move this duplicate part slightly forward. And I'm going to rename this to part 2. And I'm also going to resize from 222 down to 111. And I'm also going to make sure that the attributes are positioned correctly now. So instead of 1, because the part size is now 1, we have to do it half of the part size. So it's going to be 0.5 and -0.5. Okay, so let's now create our motor 6Ds. So inside of part 1, let's create a motor 6D. And I'm going to set part 0 to part 0, part 1 to part 1. And I'm also going to adjust the position to be 30. So now we can see it's 30 studs away from this transparent part. And then I'm going to add another motor 6D onto part 2. I'm going to set part 0 to part 1 and part 1 to part 2. And for the C-frame, I'm going to offset it by 5. Okay, so now I'm going to create the animation controller. And I'm going to go into Avatar, Animation Editor. And I'm going to select the model. And I'm going to name the animation Untitled and press Create, which should create this part inside of server storage. And what I'm going to do now is I want to rotate this part by 360 degrees in 1 second. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this part, select the rotation tool, and if I just rotate it and back, it's going to create a keyframe for us with a rotation of 000. Now, one thing we need to know about animations is it will always take the shortest path to reach its destination. So for instance, if I go to the end of this animation and I set rotation to 200, which is over here, it's not going to go around the long way to get to over here. It's going to take the shortest distance. So if I go back and press play, we can see it took the shortest distance to get to 200. And if I deleted this keyframe and set it to 360, and I now play again, we can see it doesn't move because the shortest distance is just to not move at all. So what this means is that each keyframe has to have an angle delta between the previous keyframe that is less than 180 degrees to work correctly. So let's just delete these keyframes that we created. And let's go back and create a keyframe with a 0, 0, 0 rotation. And then at 0.3, I'm going to make a keyframe. I'm going to go to my calculator and I'm going to say 360 times 0.3 equals 108. So I'm going to set this to negative 108, which rotates it over here. Then I'm going to go to 0.7, go back to my calculator, 360 times 0.7 equals 252. So the first thing I'm going to do is, we can see that because we're using Euler angles here, it has some strange behavior. So I'm going to set these back to 0. And then I'm going to set it to negative 252, which is over here. And then finally, I want to set it back to 0 over here. We could just copy and paste this over here. And now if we play the game, we can see it rotates around. And if I turn looping on and play again, we can see it just keeps looping round and round and round. Now, in order to slow this animation down a bit, I'm going to press on this gear over here, and I'm going to set playback speed to 0.25. And if I now play again, we can see now it rotates a lot slower than it did before. Okay, so what I want to do now is I want this small part to rotate around this larger part 4 times in the time it takes for this part to rotate once around the center. So to do that, what I'm going to do is on my calculator, I'm going to say 360 times 4. That means we need to rotate a 1,440 degrees in 1 second. And to do this, I'm going to rotate in increments of 0.1 from here to here, and then from here to here. So because there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 jumps. So I'm going to say divided by 10 equals 144. Another way to work that out would be 360 times 4 to get the rotation, and we want to increment in steps of 0.1, 0.1. So we could have just multiplied by 0.1 and we would have got the same value. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into model and I'm going to set the rotation degrees to 144. But the problem with that is if we set the rotation degrees to 144, Roblox doesn't really work the angle out that correctly all the time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide it by 2 to be 72. So if I set this to 72, now I need to rotate it twice to get 144 degrees. So if I go back to here, and let's now create a keyframe by just moving it up and down to create the keyframe. And then I'm going to go to 0.1 and I'm going to move it twice to do 144 degrees. Then go to 0.2, move it twice for 144 degrees and keep going like this. And once we get to the end, it should be back in its original position. So if we now play the animation, we should see that it spirals around the main part. Okay, so now that we've finished our animation, let's save it and let's publish it. And I'm going to overwrite one of my temporary animations that I use. And then we're going to copy the ID, press close. Inside of the animation controller, let's first close the animation editor, and inside of here I'm going to add a animation, and I'm going to paste the ID into animation ID. And now I'm going to create a script, and inside of the script we're going to load this animation onto this animator. Okay, so all I've done is used the animator to call the load animation function and passed in the animation to get the animation track and just start playing the animation. So let's now play the game, and we should see that it takes 1 second for the part to rotate a full 360 degrees. Now if I change the speed, so let's set the fade time to 0 and the wait to 0, and the speed, if I change this to 0.5, it's going to half the speed, which means it's going to take 2 seconds. And if I half this again down to 2.5, it's going to take 4 seconds. Now, an easy way to have this work out itself, we could just do 1 divided by how many seconds you want the animation to take. So if I wanted to take 10 seconds to complete a rotation, I could do 1 divided by 10, and now it's going to take 10 seconds for the part to do a full 360 degrees. So if I now test the game again, we should see it takes 10 seconds for this part to rotate all the way around back to the front. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to change the speed to 20 seconds to complete a loop, and then I'm going to go into the test tab and I'm going to start a local server with 1 player. So now we have the server on the left side and the client on the right side. And if I go and stand under the moving animation, we can see that I'm ever so slightly behind the animation on the server side. So we can see it's not perfectly in sync. So what's happened here? So when the server sends an event to the client telling them to start playing the animation, if the client receives this event slightly delayed because of the time it takes for the data to be sent over the internet to the client won't skip frames to catch up to the server. It will start the animation slightly behind. And this is actually what we want it to do, because we don't want the first part of the animation to stutter and skip ahead. We want the first part of the animation to be smooth and not skip ahead. So that's why we can see that the animation is ever so slightly behind the server. Another way you could think of this problem is, let's imagine that we had a punch animation that my character did when I pressed the mouse button. And let's say that the server was responsible of sending this animation to all the clients. So if I clicked and the server sent an event to all the clients saying to play the animation, and let's say that this message took 1 second to reach the clients, we would not want the clients to skip the first second of the animation. We would want them to start at the start of the animation so they see the full animation of the punch. So that's why the client does not skip forward to catch up with the server, because we want the client to see the first part of the animation. Okay, so let's now see what would happen if we start a new character while the animation is already playing. So here we can see a new client being loaded. And if we look at the animation, we can see it's in sync. And if I walk under, we can see it's roughly the same with the other client. And that is because both of these clients have the same amount of lag, because this is artificial lag, because we're currently testing in Studio. So we can see they're both delayed about the same. But if we look against the server, we can see that the clients are behind the server. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to speed up the animation by changing the speed down to 5 seconds. And then I'm going to do a task.wait, and I'm going to wait for 15 seconds. And then I'm going to say animation track adjust speed, and I'm going to set the speed to 0 to pause the animation. And if I now start a test server with one local player, and if we now see where they both paused on the server and client, we can see that they paused roughly in the same position, but the client is slightly behind because the client will pause whenever it receives the event from the server. It won't teleport the animation to the same time as the server when the pause event is received. So we can see that on the server side, the small part is at the bottom, and if we look on the client side, this small part is at the top. So when it receives the pause event, it won't teleport this animation to be in sync with the server. But if we create a new player to enter the game while the animation is already paused, let's see what would happen. So we should see that this new player should have the animation in the exact same position as the server. So we can see the parts at the bottom and the parts on the bottom on the server. So what we've learned is that animations are somewhat synchronized, but Roblox is not willing to sacrifice the integrity of the animation in order to bring them perfectly into sync, meaning that an animation will not skip frames in order to bring it into sync with the server or other clients. Okay, so let's now answer the next question. Does a paused animation consume more CPU than a stopped animation? So to test this, what I'm going to do is bring this model into server storage, and then I'm going to create a new script inside of server script service. And inside of this script, all I'm going to do is loop from -20 to +20, and on the z-axis from -42 to -2. And then I'm going to clone the model that we placed inside of server storage, and I'm going to pivot it using the X and Z coordinates and parent the clone into workspace. And now I'm going to go into the model, into animation controller, and open the script that we played the animation. But instead of just waiting 15 seconds and pausing the animation, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a while true do loop, and I'm going to do a task.wait for 15 seconds, and then I'm going to play the animation, but I'm going to set the speed to 0 so that it starts off paused, and then I'm going to wait another 15 seconds, and then I'm going to say animation track stop. So let's now remove this. So we wait 15 seconds, we start the animation but in the paused state, then we wait another 15 seconds, and then we stop the animation. And also, just so that we can know what state we're in, I'm just going to do a print, pause, and then another print, and print, stop. So if we now play the game, we should see that I use around 6 milliseconds of CPU. And let's now wait for the prints to print pause. So we can see it just printed pause, and because we had so many prints, there was a spike in the CPU usage, but then it quickly went back down to 6 milliseconds after the prints. Now we can see it printed stop, which caused a spike, but then it quickly went back down to 6 milliseconds again. So if the state is in a paused or stop state, it has the same amount of CPU usage. Okay, so what I've done now is I've gone back to the animation door that we created in the previous video. And what I want to do now is I'm going to try to bring out the synchronization problems in this door. So if I now open the animation editor, and if you remember from the previous video, we had a pause event, and on the left and right side of this pause event, we have two keyframes, and there's like a dead zone where the door doesn't move. And this helps with synchronization problems because when the pause event fires and the server sends an event to the client, if the client slightly goes out of sync, it still keeps the door in the open position. So in order to see the problem, let's remove this dead zone. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this keyframe and I'm going to move this over here. So now there is no dead zone. Another thing we can do is if we remove cubic from the easing mode, it's also going to cause the synchronization problems to be more visual. So I'm going to select these keyframes. I'm going to change the easing style to linear and the easing direction to in. So now we should see that the door opens and it instantly closes without any dead zone. Okay, so let's now publish these changes. So I'm going to first save over the untitled animation, and then I'm going to say publish to Roblox, overwrite, go down to my temporary, press save, and now the animation has been updated. Okay, so let's now go into the animation door script and let's increase the speed of the door. So if it does go out of sync, the offset is going to be even greater. So let's change the speed to 1. And let's also reduce the wait time. So instead of being 10 seconds, let's just simply wait 4 seconds before opening and closing. And let's now go into test and start a local server with 1 player. So what we should see is that the client should be greatly out of sync on its first open and close. Here we can see it's out of sync and it's going to open and shut when it resumes the animation. But if we look at the second open and close, we can see that this one was not out of sync. Let's check the next one. You can see it stops right here and it doesn't continue and go back. It just goes back because it was perfectly in sync. So the reason that happened was when the game was loading, it caused the events that were received from the server to fluctuate, which caused the door to go out of sync. So what we could do is if we make the lag ping of our client fluctuate, it should cause the door to go out of sync again. So if we go to File, Studio Settings, and if we go to Network, and over here where it says Incoming Replication Lag, it's currently set to 0. If I change this to a value of 1, we should notice that the door on the server opens first, and 1 second later, the door on the client opens. And when the door closes on the server, 1 second later, the door on the client closes. So even though the client now has a ping of 1000, we can still see that the client stays in sync, but it's just delayed. So what we can do is if I change the ping as the door is opening, it should cause it to go out of sync. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to type 0 here, and then I'm going to wait for the very moment the door starts to open. And as soon as the door starts to open, I'm going to press enter, and that's going to change the ping, and it's going to cause the door to go out of sync. So I'm going to keep looking at the door, and I press enter, which caused the door to shut early. Now, normally a player's ping should stay pretty stable and should not fluctuate that much. So this problem may not appear that often, but let's change the way our door works to solve this problem. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this door, the one that doesn't work correctly, to the left, and then I'm going to create a duplicate and move this one to the right. Now this new one we've created on the right, I'm going to duplicate the script, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to set one of them to have a run context of server, and set the other one to have a run context of client. And then I'm going to open the server script and the client script and place them side by side. Now, instead of having the animation track on the server side, let's have the animation track on the client side. So I'm going to delete this part of the script, and over here, I'm going to replace the play and adjust speed to set attributes on the doors model. So I'm going to say script.parent set attribute, and I'm going to name this attribute open, and I'm going to set it to true, and I'm going to delete this play, and after the 4 seconds I'm going to set open to nil. We could also set it to false, but I'm choosing to set it to nil. And now we've finished the server side. And now on the client side, instead of having this loop, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say script.parent get attribute changed signal, and we're going to wait for the open attribute to change, and I'm going to connect a function, and then I'm going to say if script.parent get attribute open, then and else. So if the open attribute is set, we're going to play the animation, and if it's not set, we're going to set the speed to 1. Okay, so if we now play test the game, we can see that on the server side, the one on the left still animates, but the one that animates on the client side no longer moves. But if we look on the client side, we can see that both of them open and close at the same time. So they're currently working the same, so there's no difference between the two. And if we go into File, Studio Settings, Network, and let's change the lag to 1, and we should see that now they both open and close 1 second late. So they're still working the same. But if I change this to 0 and wait for when the door is just about to open and press enter, we can see the one on the right worked correctly, but the one on the left didn't work correctly. Okay, so let's now work on this door, and let's delete the other door that doesn't work correctly. And I'm going to move this back into the center, and I'm going to add a proximity prompt on the slab. So I'm over here, I'm going to say proximity prompt, and I'm just going to keep this as default. The only thing I'm going to change is I'm going to turn off requires line of sight. The next thing I want to do is allow the door to open in both directions. So what I'm going to do is under avatar, open the animation editor and select the door, and it's asking me to create a animation. So I'm just going to create one like this, which is this one over here, and I'm going to move this into this door, and then I'm going to press load untitled, and now we should have the same animation. So now instead of having the door start closed, then open in one direction and then go back into the closed direction, what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this keyframe over here, and then I'm going to move this over here and move this to the center. So now the door starts open and then goes to the center and closes, and then over this side it should open but in the opposite direction. Select the slab and rotate it, and now it should open like so. I'm also going to set the easing style back to cubic, so I'm going to select all 3 keyframes, change the easing style to cubic V2, and change the direction to in and out. So now it should open like so. And then I'm going to add 2 more events, and I'm also going to change this event over here. So I'm going to double click on this event, and this pause event, I'm going to set the perimeter to 0.5 because it's at a time of 0.5, and save. And then over here, I'm going to add a event. I'm going to call it pause and set it to 0 because the time is 0. And at the end, add an event, name it pause, and set the perimeter to 1. Okay, so I'm now going to save the changes, and I'm going to publish the changes and overwrite my temporary animation. Okay, so let's now close the animation editor and reopen the server and then this client script and place them side by side. Okay, so let's now first work on the server side. I'm going to comment out this while true do loop. And what I want to do is detect when a player triggers the proximity prompt. So I'm going to say script.parent.slab.proximity prompt triggered connect function. And this function is going to receive which player triggered the proximity prompt. The next thing I want to do is check which side of the door the player's character is standing on. So let's first check to make sure that the player has a character. So I'm going to say if player.character equals nil, then return and do nothing. And then if we know there is a character, I'm going to use the frames C-frame and convert the character's position into the C-frame's object space. So to do this, I'm going to say local p equals script.parent.frame.cframe, and I'm going to use point to object space. And inside of this function, I'm going to pass the player's characters, and we could get the pivot of the character model, or we could use the humanoid root part dot position, like so. And just to see that this is working, all I'm going to do is print p and play the game. And if I stand here, press E, we should see that it prints this value here. And if I go to the other side and press E, we can see it prints this. Now, what we're looking at is not the y-axis, because this is going to tell us how high up we are compared to the frame. And this is going to tell us how what side on the x-axis from this frame. But we want to look at this number here. If it's a negative number, that means we're on the back of the frame. If it's a positive number, it means we're on the front of the frame. So over here, we would be in front. And if I go even further in front and press E from here, we can see it goes up to 9. And if I go over this side, press E, -5. If I walk back, we can see -9. Okay, so now that we know this P value is being set correctly, let's use the Z-axis to know if we need to open the door forward or backwards. So instead of saving it into P, what I'm going to say is if dot Z, to get the Z-axis, is more than 0, then else. So this means we need to open in one direction, and this means we need to open in the opposite direction. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is work on the client side a little bit. So I'm going to comment out this part of the code. And the first thing I want to do is I just want to play the animation, but I'm going to set the speed to 0 so it starts in the paused state. Now, if I just play the game like this, we should see that the door instantly opens, because remember that 0 on the animation was open in one direction, 0.5 was closed, and 1 was open in the opposite direction. Okay, so what I want to do is, instead of starting at a position of 0, I want to start at a position of 0.5 so that the animation of the door starts where the door is closed. So I'm going to select the animation door model. I'm going to add an attribute, give it a number attribute, and call it time. And I'm going to set time to 0.5 so it starts in the center of the animation. Then over here, I'm going to say animation track dot time position equals script dot parent get attribute time. So now if we play the game, we can see that the door starts closed. And if I set the time to 0.2, it should be slightly open, but not fully open, like so. But there is one problem. If I set the time to 1, which is the end of the animation, and I press play, we should see that the animation starts open on this side, but then closes because the animation stops, because the animation believes it's reached the end of the animation. So the animation is no longer playing, which causes the door to go back to its original state. So what we need to do is add a bit of buffer zone at the end of the animation, so the animation does not believe it's reached the end. So to do this, I'm going to open the animation editor once again, and I'm going to move this down to 0.4 and move this down to 0.8. So now if we play, and if we move this event over here and move this event over here and play again, we can see that now this part over here is the end. So from here to here, and this is the end. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this last and paste it over here. And now we can see the whole animation is the end, but we're only going to use up to this part over here. Or instead of using a keyframe, we could even use a event. So let's delete this one over here. Let's add a event, and let's just call this end. And now it still believes that the animation goes all the way up to 1, but we're only going to use up to this part, and this part at the end is never going to be used. So let's now save the animation again, and let's publish to Roblox. And let's now test to see if it works. So if I set the model to have an animation time of 0.8, which is the end of the part that we're going to be using, it should not stop when we play the game. And we can see now it's stuck in this open state. Okay, so let's now change the attribute back to 0.4, which is now the center, which is where the door is closed. And what I want to do is bring back the marker reached. And over here, we're going to get the time that we set in the marker. So I'm going to say marker time. But the thing is, we forgot to update the marker times. So let's go back to that animation editor. And let's double click on these markers. So this one's correct, 0. This one was 0.5, but it's now changed to 0.4. This one over here is now 0.8. And let's save and publish. Okay, so now what I want to do is when we try to open the door, I'm going to update the time attribute to be either 0 or 0.8. So I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to set the time attribute. And if it's over here, I'm going to set it to 0.8. And if we're standing on this side, I'm going to set it to 0. Okay, I'm now going to delete this while true do loop. And now what I want to do is on the client side, I want to bring back this signal event. But instead of using the open, we're going to use time. So let's change this to time. Now I'm going to save this time attribute into a variable. So I'm going to say local target time equals script.parent get attribute. And I'm going to get the time attribute. And then I'm going to check it against this time position. So I'm going to say if animation track time position is less than the target time, then I'm going to set the speed to a positive number. We can have any speed we want. I'm just going to set it to 0.5 for now. And then I'm going to say else if, now the reason I'm using if, because if it's the same, if this value and this value are the same, we want to set the speed to 0. So it doesn't continue to move forward or back. So else if, and I'm going to copy this. If it's but not less than, we can check if it's more than the target time, then that means we need to set it to a negative number. So negative 0.5. And then finally, I'm going to say else, I'm going to set it to a speed of 0. So it doesn't continue to move and it stays at the target time. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is delete this part over here. And what I want to do is check to see if this target time and marker time are the same when we reach the pause location. If they are the same, I'm going to stop the animation. So what I'm going to do is say if, and to get the target time, we just need to read the attribute. So I'm going to say if script.parent get attribute time equals marker time, then we're going to pause the animation. But one problem we have is this marker time property parameter that's passed from the animation is a string, not a number. So we have to either convert this into a number or convert this number into a string. So let's convert this to a string. So I'm going to say toString and pass in the time property attribute. And now this should work correctly. So let's play the game. And if I open over here, we can see it opens that way. If I try to open it again, it doesn't work. But if I try to open it from this side, we can see it opens, but then we can see it closed. So the reason for that is because we had added a buffer to the right side, but when we adjust the speed to be a negative number, we never added a buffer to the left side of the animation. So the way to fix that is the same way we did it before. Go into Avatar, and then I'm going to open the editor. And just like we did over here, we had added a buffer. I'm also going to add a buffer. So first I'm going to move this to 0.5, and then I'm going to move this to 0.1 and move this mark over here. And I'm also going to move this up to 0.9 so that it matches on both sides. And here we have the end marker, and over here I'm going to have a new event called start. And then what I'm going to do is update these markers, pause events. So this needs to be 0.1. This needs to be 0.5. And this needs to be 0.9. So now we're going to be using this part from 0.1 up to 0.9, and this part at the end and this end are going to be buffers to stop the animation from stopping. Okay, so let's now save our changes and publish the changes. And let's now close the editor. And let's go back into the animation door model and change time to start at 0.5 because it's now moved back up to the center. And let's go back onto the server side script and change this to 0.9. And this should start at 0.1. Okay, so if we now play the game, we should see that I can open the door from this side and it stays there. And if I open the door from this side, it goes to the other side, but we can see that it teleports back to the center, but the animation has not stopped, because if I go back to this side and press E again, we can see now it moves to that side. So it still stays paused, but for some reason, when it gets to this side, it teleports back to the center. And the reason for that is these keyframes only work forward. So this keyframe is valid from here up to the center, and this keyframe is valid from here to here, and this keyframe is valid from here to the end. So this end part works, but there's no keyframe over here to make this part over here work. So what I'm going to do is, instead of using events, I'm going to just copy and paste these over here. So let's delete this, and let's also delete this, and let's now copy this and paste it over here. And let's also copy this and paste it over here. So now we still have the buffer zone, but instead of using events, we're using keyframes. Okay, so let's now save once again and publish. overwrite, temporary, save, closed, and let's close the editor and press play. And we should see that if I open from this side, it works fine. If I open from this side, it should now work fine. It no longer teleports to the center. I can open it from this side or this side. If I try to open from here, it doesn't work. If I go on this side of the door, it does open. Okay, so everything about our code seems to be working fine. The only problem we have is we're no longer able to close the door. So what I'm going to do is over here, after we check if there's a character, I'm going to say if the attribute of time is equal to 0.5, then we're going to open using the character's position. Else, we're going to set the attribute back to 0.5, like so. And if we now play the game again, what we should see is if the door is closed and we press, it opens. If I press it again, it now closes. Then if I press it again, it opens. And there we have it. We've completed our client-sided animation doors. Now, if you really wanted to, you could move this code over to the server side and have these doors work 100% on the server side, but I've decided to show you how to do it on the client side. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment down below.